Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to give you an overview on adaptation policies in Italy with a focus on the role of the different geographical levels. So let's get started with the European Union strategy for adaptation. The first one was launched in 2013 with the aim to make European territory more resilient. Come faccio, scusa, a far andare via questi?
Che succede?
Ma vedete voi la griglia?
Sì. Ok.
Come faccio ad abbassarla, no?
Noi vediamo tutto correttamente, quindi puoi andare avanti.
Ah, ok. So the main aim of the 2013 European Union strategy was to make the European Union more resilient through the adoption of strategies and action plans at the different geographical scales. So the role of the European Union is to support the member states through guidelines, funding programs, data sharing, and so on. At the beginning of this year, the European Union launched a new strategy with the aim to reinforce the adaptive capacity of the European Union territory, reducing vulnerability and increasing resilience. And the European Union highlight that there is a need to do that in a just and fair way. So it has introduced a close link between adaptation policies and climate justice. It also indicated the deadline, that is 2050, so it is the same deadline of European Union mitigation policies, and it is very important because it helps the integration between mitigation and adaptation policies. Well, the European Union strategies also highlight the leading role of national governments in supporting the subnational levels, because, as you know, both impacts and the responses depend on the local characteristics, on the complexity of the territory, and so on. So in 2014, Italy launched its national strategy that has developed a national vision identifying the main impacts of climate change on environmental resources and on a set of socioeconomic sectors that are considered relevant at a national level. Here you can find the list of the sectors, and in some cases, so biodiversity, agriculture, and infrastructures, there is also a subdivision into a number of subsectors. Then the focus is also on two special cases that are represented by mountain areas and the Po River Basin district, because they are considered particularly at risk because of their complexity. Well, so the national strategy has also indicated a set of actions and guidelines, so through both a sectoral and an intersectoral perspective. 3 years later was published the national plan. So the national plan translates theory into practice, defining methods, deadlines, financial resources, as well as roles and responsibilities for the different steps. So for implementation, evaluation, and monitoring of the actions and guidelines indicated in the national strategy. So this is the framework at a national level. Well, the key point is at the subnational levels, because in Italy, applying the adaptation policies is not statutory for the subnational levels, and the local administration and the local administrations that decide to implement these processes do it only on a voluntary basis. So as you can see, the risk is to create much confusion, because policymakers can interpret adaptation in very different ways, looking at the underlying social and economic processes, as well as institutional and decision-making processes. So to give you an idea, only 4 regions have adopted adaptation policies, but with very different, in very different perspectives and with very different visions. So, for example, the Lombardia region has both the adaptation strategy and the action document. Emilia-Romagna has an integrated mitigation and adaptation strategy, so looking at a very different vision. Abruzzo only has the adaptation plan, while Sardinia only the adaptation strategy. So only 4 regions, but with very different and in a very heterogeneous situation. Then looking at the local level, municipalities that are developing or have developed adaptation policies are involved in 1 or more transnational municipal networks. In some cases, like Global Resilient Cities, Making Cities Resilient, and C40, they only focus on big cities. In other cases like ICLEI, Climate Alliance, and the Covenant of Mayors, they focus both on big and on small cities. As you know, the most popular is the Covenant of Mayors, and in Italy there are more than 5,000 initiatives. We talk about initiatives because small towns can also group together in participating in the covenant. Well, looking at the relationships between adaptation policies and climate justice, according to the international literature, there are some principles that should be considered into adaptation processes in terms of climate justice. So, for example, avoiding damage, take responsibility for future changes, and put the most vulnerable at the center. Well, the national strategy and plan focus mostly on the first 2 principles. So, in particular, on how to reduce impacts and damage, how to take responsibility for future changes in terms of improving awareness and empowerment, coordinating sectoral policies, and so on. While in some cases, regional strategies and plans also focus on the most vulnerable groups and communities, because they are developing a number of interesting participatory processes. And among these processes, one that is, in my opinion, very interesting is the Emilia-Romagna Agreement for the Employment and the Climate. Because different institutions, so the region, universities, local municipalities, as well as representatives of the economic categories, labor unions, and schools are grouped together and are considering climate justice from different perspectives and with a number of different goals. The focus is on work. So they aim at improving the quality of jobs, reducing disparities, and increasing also the quality of life. But they also consider other perspectives like the ecological transition, the sustainable development goals of the Agenda 2030, and so on. So it is very interesting for looking at the different sectors considered, perspective considered, and so. Then it's obvious the municipal strategies and plans also focus on the most vulnerable groups and communities through specific initiatives. For example, looking at how to reduce the exposure of old people to heat waves, how to reduce the exposure of poor people to floods, because as you know, in many cases, poor people live in flood-prone areas, and so on. Well, to conclude, and looking at the Covenant of Mayors, that, as you know, is the most popular initiative at a local level, there is a problem. Until last year, the goals were only referred to mitigation. Now, with the new deadline, so with the 2030 deadline, the goals are referred both to mitigation and to adaptation. But as you know, for small cities and towns, it is easy to develop mitigation policies and also to achieve mitigation goals. But at present, it's very difficult for these towns to create and develop adaptation policies. So there's a need to support in particular small cities and towns in this process. So in the process, looking at the creation and implementation of adaptation policies, and in particular, they need to be supported in the inclusion of climate justice, the climate justice perspective and the climate justice goals in these adaptation processes. So in my opinion, geography and geographers can play an important role in these processes, looking at this perspective. Thank you very much for your attention.